Hey there, this is Alexis Knight, and welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may seem clear, but the truth? That's another story. Because of their nature, these cases are difficult to decide, and it leaves people at odds with each other. The court has made its ruling, but what do you think? Today, we're going to dive into a case that has sparked endless debate. So listen closely, and by the end of this episode, you're going to have a chance to decide for yourself. Was justice truly served, or is there more to the story? All right, let's get into it. In this episode, we're going to dive into one of the most horrific crimes involving peer influence and young minds gone dangerously astray. This is the chilling story of the murder of Shanda Sharer. In January of 1992, in the town of Madison, Indiana. This town was so shaken to its core by the brutal murder of 12-year-old Shanda. The details of the crime sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. What made this crime particularly shocking was not just the violent nature of it, but the fact that it was orchestrated and carried out by a group of teenage girls. At the center of the crime was Melinda Loveless. She was a 16-year-old who harbored a deep-seated jealousy toward Shanda over a romantic rivalry. Remember, these are young teenagers. Loveless, along with three other girls, Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence, they would go on to kidnap and torture and ultimately murder Shanda in an unspeakably cruel fashion. This case raises pressing questions. How could teenage girls who seemingly lived ordinary lives commit such a heinous act? Was this a case of peer influence and group dynamics spiraling out of control? Or was there something more sinister at play with the minds of these young perpetrators? In this episode, we are going to break down how the manipulation and influence between these girls led to a murder that has haunted Indiana for decades. What role did each girl play? Were they all equally responsible? Or was there a ringleader pulling the strings? And most importantly, what does this case tell us about the darker side of adolescence and peer influence? By the end of this episode, you are going to be left to decide, was this case of teenage girls being led into violence by the influence of one dangerous mind, or were they all capable of this kind of evil on their own? Let's find out. The murder of Shanda Sharer, this is not just a story of violence. This is a chilling tale of how one teenager's rage spiraled into a deadly group dynamic that ended in tragedy. The big question that still divides the public to this day is whether this crime was a result of peer pressure and manipulation, or if each of these girls involved was equally evil in their own right. Let's take a step back and look at the relationships at the heart of this case. At just 12 years old, Shanda Sharer was young and full of life, navigating the challenges of adolescence. But in the background, a twisted and dangerous rivalry was brewing. Shanda had recently become romantically involved with another girl, Amanda. This alone wouldn't have been particularly unusual, except that Amanda had previously been involved with Melinda. And just a quick break here to remind us who's all involved here. We have Melinda Loveless at the center of everything at 16, and then the three other girls, Lori, Hope, and Toni. Okay, well, Melinda here, she's not ready to let go of Amanda. Now remember, Melinda's only 16 at the time, but her anger and her jealousy were far beyond what most teenagers experience in high school love triangles. Fueled by rage and obsession, however, Melinda made Shanda the target of her fury and soon began plotting her revenge. But she did not act alone. And this is where things get murkier. Instead of confronting Shanda on her own, Melinda recruited those three other girls, Lori, Hope, and Tony. All were around the same age, but with vastly different personalities and motivations. Lori was known for being wild and rebellious, even dabbling in satanic practices. Hope and Tony, on the other hand, they seemed more timid, unsure of what they were getting into when they agreed to help. So the question we're left with is this: how much influence did Melinda have over these other girls? Were Hope and Tony simply followers, caught up in a situation that they did not fully understand? Or did they make their own conscious decision to participate in Shanda's murder and were just evil on their own? Was Lori the catalyst, pushing the group into more violent territory? Or was she simply another pawn in Melinda's sick game? What we do know is that none of these girls acted alone that night. Melinda lured Shanda out of her house under the pretense of wanting to talk. But once Shanda was in their grip, the situation escalated quickly. The girls drove Shanda to a remote location where she was brutally tortured and eventually set on fire. This raises a major point of debate. Could any of them have stopped this? And did they go along with the violence because they were too afraid to challenge Melinda? Because we hear that one a lot. I was afraid they would turn on me, so I just complied and did what they said. Or were they just as guilty, feeding off the group's collective energy to commit an act of pure evil? This is always the question in situations like this. Psychologists often talk about how groupthink can lead to terrible decisions. In some situations, people do things they would never do on their own simply because there's pressure or excitement of the group and it pushes them forward. Was this what happened in this case? Did peer influence override their individual morality? And if so, where does the line between manipulation and personal accountability get drawn? I mean, we're all human. We all have our morals, and they all can be broken. And we all are at risk of being pressured to break them. This happens every single day. This is not a question just for these girls. It's a question for all of us. Could you make a decision that goes against your morals, do you think? But with the right manipulation and heavy influence over time, could it get you to change how you behave? And remember, it's easier to think about ourselves, right? Oh, I would never do that. But it scares you a little bit, doesn't it, when you hear about these cases where someone gets influenced, someone that would never do something? So it does make you a little nervous, you have to admit. This is the situation in a lot of court cases where it's just not so cut and dried. Because this case isn't as simple as blaming Melinda Loveless alone. I mean, yes, she was clearly the one who set the plan in motion. This was clear. But when you look at how each girl played a role that night, it's impossible to say that anyone was simply an innocent bystander. So how should we think about group dynamics in cases like this? Do we really, or can we really, excuse the actions of others? Can we excuse the actions of the other girls by saying that they were manipulated? Because there was a ringleader? We want to blame someone. Let's blame the ringleader. But then it gets fuzzy when there's these other helpers. I mean, is there a darker truth here about the nature of influence and evil in all of us? As we unravel the details of what happened on this night in this case, we're going to dig deeper into how each girl became a part of this murder and whether peer influence was enough to push them all over the edge. And ultimately, we will be left to wonder, was Melinda the mastermind who pulled all of the strings, or were they all equally responsible for the horror that happened? And what makes this case even more unsettling is how throughout the night there were multiple opportunities for one of the girls to back out. So, in the beginning, Tony, the quietest and seemingly least involved, expressed discomfort with what was going on. She didn't actively participate in much of the torture, but she didn't leave either. Many argue that had she left, she could have sought help, alerted authorities, potentially saving Shanda's life. But Tony did not do that. She stayed silent. Hope also. She too could have pulled away at any time, but instead she participated in the torture and burning of Shanda's body. It's this blurred line between active participation and passive complicity that makes this case so complex. Did the fear of Melinda's wrath or the excitement of being a part of something so extreme, cause the other girls to ignore their own better instincts? Or were they simply too far gone to care at that point? In fact, throughout that night, the girls did have more than one opportunity to let Shanda go. At one point, Shanda begged for her life, offering to never mention ever what had happened to anyone if they just would let her live. And this was a pivotal moment. Shanda's plea could have snapped any one of them out of their collective madness, but it did not. Instead, the violence actually escalated. The way this crime unfolded shows how dangerous groupthink can be, and we are all susceptible. And not just for crimes. It's a known psychological phenomenon that when people are in groups, all of our friends and besties, their sense of individuality diminishes. You kind of take cover under your group, right? Together, we have this shield that makes us stronger than others. I have power behind me with all these people. But when the individuality of someone diminishes, they become more likely to take risks or engage in extreme or risky behavior that they normally would not. And was that the case here? Were these girls merely just feeding off each other's energy, driving the situation into darker and more violent territory than any of them might have reached on their own? And how does that apply to the modern world here today, where teenagers are often subjected to peer pressure in more subtle ways? Social media, bullying, online and off, and group dynamics, they can all play a role in pushing young minds to the brink. And we hear about it in the news sometimes, but we don't hear about all of it because it's too much for us to take. Is it possible, though, that something like this could happen again today? You'd have to think that all peer pressure and the ability to manipulate it are gone if you don't think that is the case. As we get deeper into this case here, these are the questions that linger. Melinda was certainly the catalyst, everyone agrees. But what about Lori, Hope, and Tony? What made them follow Melinda's lead that night? Was it fear of retaliation? Maybe a desire to fit in? Or was it something more sinister, just lurking inside them all along? Because to convict someone that's on the sidelines, you either believe that, yes, they are evil. 2, you don't believe in manipulation. And 3, you do believe in manipulation. But once someone has been manipulated, you're just a little too afraid of them to keep them out of prison. It's a tough, tough, tough thing. This case forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that influence and peer pressure and a lack of moral clarity can sometimes lead to devastating consequences. And these are children. So if you get a little nervous thinking about being manipulated as yourself, if you're an adult out there, imagine being 14 or 16 and you're just trying to fit in and do the right thing. So as we continue, I ask you to consider this. Where do we draw the line between individual responsibility and the power of group influence? What can we be comfortable with here? And should the other girls be held just as accountable as Melinda? Or were they victims also of a dangerous and manipulative leader. This crime, the murder of Shanda Sharer, this was not just a shocking crime because it was shocking, but it also was a crime that had more details to make you more uncomfortable. It was a crime that unfolded in horrifying detail over the course of several hours, and it also involved multiple locations, and it left behind a trail of terror that would haunt those involved and the community for decades. To understand the full weight of this tragedy, we need to break down the events of that night and the roles each of the girls played. All right, let's get into it. It all began on the night of January 10th in 1992, when 16-year-old Melinda Loveless, consumed with jealousy over Shanda's relationship with Amanda, she decided to take matters into her own hands and recruited 3 girls to help her. Lori, 17 at the time, and 2 younger girls, Hope and Tony, who were only 15. And each girl had their own reasons for getting involved, but it's important to understand that none of them acted completely out of duress. They willingly participated in the events that would unfold. And the plan, it was simple, at least at first. Melinda wanted to scare Shanda, maybe rough her up even, and send a message that she was not going to tolerate this relationship with Amanda. But once the girls picked up Shanda, things quickly spiraled out of control. Lori, who was known for her wild and unpredictable behavior, she was very eager to push things further, and the others followed her lead. Shanda was lured out of her house by Tony and Hope, and they told her that Amanda wanted to meet her. At the time, Shanda had no reason to suspect danger. She was just a young girl, excited and a little nervous to meet Amanda. But when she got into the car, she found Melinda waiting for her in the back seat, and the mood shifted immediately. Melinda began taunting Shanda, and it quickly became clear that this was not going to be a simple meeting. The girls drove to a remote location known as the Witch's Castle. It's an old abandoned building that had a reputation for being creepy and haunted. It was here that the first signs of physical violence began. Melinda pulled out a knife and threatened Shanda, but the real torment was just beginning. Over the next few hours, Shanda would be beaten, tortured, and humiliated by the group. At various points, the girls had the opportunity to stop. In fact, they left the witch's castle at one point, driving around aimlessly with Shanda still in the car. You know, she's bleeding and she's terrified, but there she is. And instead of letting her go, they just continue the violence. Lori, who seemed to relish in this brutality, took the lead in the next phase of the attack. They drove Shanda to another remote location where they took turns assaulting her. The violence escalated with each stop, by the way. And by the time they reached the third location, Shanda, well, she was barely conscious. She was still alive, however. In a final horrific act, these girls doused her with gasoline, and then they set her on fire. And it was Hope who lit the match, sealing Shanda's fate. Sit back for a second and imagine any teenage girls that might be in your lives, nieces, daughters, having this happen to them or doing this. That's crazy. Now, Shanda's body is found the next morning by a group of hunters. But by then, of course, the damage had been done. The girls, all under the age of 18, had committed an act so brutal that it shocked not only their small town, but the entire nation. And you can see why. If you didn't know about this case, it's pretty shocking. But what led these seemingly ordinary teenage girls to commit such a heinous crime? And to understand that, we need to look at the background and the motivations of each girl involved. And this is also something that when we're watching the news, the court of public opinion, we don't get a lot of these details. We get the summary of the narrative that is being pushed. I mean, not often do you hear crimes of minors about their backgrounds and motivations, or were they on medications or things like this. You just don't get to know. So here we go. Now, Melinda, of course, the ringleader, she had a history of anger issues. She had been in and out of trouble for years, and her jealousy and obsession with Amanda drove her to target Shanda. But she wasn't alone in the act. Did her deep emotional issues and desire for control over Amanda give her magic powers to manipulate the other girls into participating? It's a question. And then you have Lori. Now, Lori, on the other hand, she was known for her rebellious nature. She had a fascination with the occult and was seen by some as a troublemaker. This makes her more easy to believe, right? But there's more to her story. Lori's childhood was also marked by abuse and neglect. And some psychologists believe that her involvement in this murder was her way of seeking control and power, things that she lacked in her own life. She was, in many ways, the perfect accomplice for Melinda when you think about it, because she's just there, ready and willing to push the limits. And she was okay with violence. Then we have Hope and Tony, the 15-year-olds. They present a more complex picture. Both girls were younger and less experienced in terms of the kind of rebellion and violence that defined Melinda and Lori's lives. Hope was the one who ultimately set Shanda on fire, but there are many that argue that she was merely following orders and that she was just too afraid to stand up to the others. Tony, on the other hand, appeared to be the most reluctant participant, expressing discomfort throughout the night and later confessing to the crime, which some believe shows she was not entirely complicit in the same way as the others were. But here's the unsettling truth, okay? Regardless of their individual roles, all four girls participated in this murder. They had multiple opportunities to stop. They could have walked away, called for help, but none of them did any of those things. And that's what makes this case so disturbing. How a group of teenage girls who should have been hanging out at the mall, maybe thinking about homework, how could they commit such a cold-blooded and calculated act of violence? And by the way, is it so easy to get away from someone you're terrified of? Battered women never leave, right? We hear that story all the time. They can't. It's too hard and scary for so many reasons. They can't explain to someone else. Is that what happens in an event like this? Can you be afraid but still do the act out of more fear is basically what this is saying. But on the other side, what evil had taken root here? The trial that followed, of course, a media circus, like so many cases like this, with each girl's role in the murder being scrutinized. Melinda was quickly identified as the mastermind. She's sentenced to 60 years in prison. Remember, she was 16. Lori received the same sentence. Hope and Tony, they got lighter sentences due to their lesser roles in the crime. But even with the convictions, many in the public were left unsatisfied. Some believed that all four girls deserved the exact same punishment, while others argued that Hope and Tony, they were victims. They were victims of peer pressure. They were not cold-blooded killers. And you have the families. Shanda's family, they were left devastated. They lost a daughter in the most brutal way imaginable. No sentence can bring her back. So for them, the question of why this happened, it's never truly answered. Putting the girls in prison does not give them their happiness and daughter back. How could a group of teenage girls turn on one of their own? And could this have been prevented somehow? As we continue to explore this case, it is important to remember that the facts are only part of the story, because there are a lot of psychological dynamics at play here. We have the groupthink, the influence Melinda had over the others. That's kind of what makes this case so chilling, because it gets messy, right? And it scares us, because are we that vulnerable also? Could we be? Well, we're going to dive deeper into those dynamics and get into things. But at this point, the facts remain, right? Shanda Sharer was a victim of one of the most brutal crimes committed by a group of teenagers, and the legacy of that crime continues to haunt the public. But okay, beyond the immediate facts of this crime, the story of Shanda Sharer's murder also sheds light on some disturbing societal issues, issues that continue to resonate today. For one, the case brings into sharp focus the question of peer influence and the power it can have over young, impressionable minds. I mean, even adults join cults, guys, right? Was it fear of Melinda, or was it something darker? Did they have it in them the whole time? Something inside themselves that they just had yet to fully understand? Melinda's jealousy was the spark, but it was the group dynamic that fanned it into a deadly flame. Groupthink, as we've seen in other cases of violence, often plays a crucial role in pushing people beyond their normal boundaries. Alone, any one of these girls might have balked at the idea of murder, but together, their collective energy and their excitement of the situation, it didn't hold them back. Oh no, it propelled them forward. As each girl crossed a moral boundary, it became harder for the others to pull back. And in the end, none of them did they? Lori, with her fascination for the macabre and her rebellious streak, seemed to feed off of Melinda's jealousy, gave her something to do and work on. Lori's behavior that night is one of the key factors that made the crime even more brutal. In fact, some psychologists have argued that Lori's personality and background may have contributed as much to the crime as Melinda's jealousy did. Quite the pair. Lori grew up in an abusive household. She had been exposed to violence from a very young age. Her rebellious nature and interest in Satanism gave her an air of danger that the other girls might have found intimidating or maybe thrilling. But so you look at Lori, I mean, was she a product of her environment? Or did she actively seek out violence as a way to exert control? And this is where the lines between victim and perpetrator blur. Lori may have been influenced by her troubled upbringing, but that doesn't excuse her actions that night. She played a key role in torturing Shanda, and she was present during every phase of the attack. Some might argue that Lori was just as much of a ringleader as Melinda, pushing the group to take the violence further than it might have gone otherwise. And then there's Hope. She was the one who actually lit the match that set Shanda on fire. And remember, Hope was only 15 years old at the time. 15 years. And many have questioned how much of her participation was due to fear or peer pressure. Did she light the match because she was afraid of Melinda and Lori? Or was there something more sinister for her at play? Hope's role in the murder has always been a point of contention because people can't quite figure it out. Was she manipulated into this? Or did she willingly go along with the plan from the beginning, more enthusiastically, like Lori? And if she was truly afraid, why didn't she just refuse to participate? But that question's tricky, isn't it? You're afraid of the person hurting you like they're trying to do to someone else, but you're going to say no to them. I would think at that point, that's why you're doing it, right? Because you are afraid of saying no because you think they're going to hurt you. This is the problem. But we love to ask, well, they could have just said no. Sometimes it's not that easy, though, when you're in that situation and someone's basically threatening you with all their adrenaline in the situation that's at play, that you feel like you have no choice. And that's what people struggled with here with Hope. And then there's Tony. She presents an entirely different picture because she was the quietest and the least involved of the four girls. She did not actively participate in the torture or the killing of Shanda, but she was there the whole time. And while she expressed discomfort with what was happening, she never left. But ask yourself, when would she have left? Would that have been easy? Wouldn't she be someone who knows something, someone dangerous? And that might make her want to stay. Some people believe that Tony was just a bystander who was too afraid to stand up to the others. But there are those that are going to argue, and they are arguing that her silence and failure to act doesn't matter. It makes her just as guilty as the rest. In cases like this, complicity often carries its own weight of responsibility, and it's very tricky. The media quickly, of course, latched onto this angle of peer influence, painting the crime as an extreme example of what can happen when impressionable, young, and innocent minds fall under the sway of a stronger, more dangerous personality. And while there's certainly some truth to that narrative, it's important to remember here that each of these girls, the girls involved, made their own choices that night. Melinda may have been the instigator, but Lori, Hope, and Tony all did have opportunities to walk away at different times, to refuse to participate, but none of them did that. And that's always bothering everybody. As we look at the facts of this case, it's clear that the dynamics between the girls played a huge role in the events. Peer pressure and groupthink and fear of being ostracized or maybe punished. They're all common factors in crimes like this. Psychologists and legal experts, they have debated this issue for years. And some will argue that Melinda should bear the majority of the blame here, as she is the one who orchestrated the crime and manipulated the others into helping her. But there are others that say, hey, Lori, Hope, and Tony, they were fully aware of what they were doing, and they should be held just as accountable. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. It's possible that peer influence played a significant role, but at the end of the day, each girl made a choice to participate in this torture and murder Shanda Sharer. And by the way, the aftermath of this crime was as devastating as the crime itself, because now this is done. This has happened, this great act of jealousy. Well, Shanda's family was shattered by the loss of their daughter. The community of Madison, Indiana, was left grappling with the fact that such a horrific act had actually been committed, and by a group of local girls. The trial, media spectacle, with reporters from across the country descending on the small town to cover this case. And the public was horrified, not just by the brutality of the murder, but by the fact that it had been carried out by these teenagers. All right, well, now that we've covered the facts, let's get into the arguments that were actually presented during this trial. The prosecution and defense in this case had vastly different interpretations, as you can imagine, of what happened that night, and both sides presented compelling yet deeply troubling arguments. The prosecution's case centered around the idea that Melinda was the mastermind behind the murder, and they argued that her deep-seated jealousy towards Shanda Sharer fueled a premeditated plan to kill her. From the prosecution's perspective, Melinda was a calculated and manipulative leader who exploited the vulnerabilities of the other girls to carry out her horrific revenge. They pointed to the extensive planning that took place before the crime, including the fact that Melinda had spoken about hurting or killing Shanda for weeks leading up to the murder. Witnesses testified that Melinda's obsession with Amanda, and by extension Shanda, had taken over her life. She couldn't stand the thought of losing Amanda, and she saw Shanda as a threat that needed to be eliminated. If I can't have you, no one can. The prosecution also highlighted the fact that Melinda brought a knife with her on the night of the murder. Clear evidence, they say, that she had intended from the start to harm Shanda. This violence was not spontaneous. It was planned, they say. This was critical in establishing Melinda as the ringleader, and it helped the prosecution build the case for premeditated murder. When it came to the other girls, the prosecution took a somewhat different approach. Lori was portrayed as Melinda's right-hand accomplice, someone more than willing to take part in this violent crime. They argued that Lori's fascination with the occult and her history of rebellion made her an eager participant. They painted Lori as someone who was not influenced by Melinda, but who was actively enjoying the brutality of this crime. Hope and Tony, however, they were weaker players and seen as such in the group. The prosecution acknowledged that Hope and Tony were less involved in the planning, but they argued that by the time the murder took place, both girls had made conscious choices to participate. Hope, in particular, faced the intense scrutiny for her role in lighting that match. The prosecution contended that despite her age, Hope was fully aware of what she was doing and had crossed the line from follower to perpetrator. As for Tony, they recognized her reluctance, but they argued that her silence and failure to act made her even more complicit, contending that Tony had multiple opportunities, again, to seek help, stop the violence, or just leave, but she didn't. And because of that, she was held accountable for her role in the crime. The argument for the prosecution, it was clear. Melinda orchestrated the murder. Lori enthusiastically participated, and Hope and Tony, although less involved, they were aware and they chose to participate. And of course, we have the defense. They're going to have a different story, and they did. Melinda's defense team did not deny that she had been involved in this crime. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no point in trying to even claim that she wasn't guilty, but instead they focused on her troubled background, and they argued that Melinda was a product of influence herself, years of abuse and neglect. Her childhood had been marked by violence, both in the home and in her personal relationships. Her father was known to be abusive, and Melinda had suffered years of emotional and physical trauma. The defense argued that this trauma had warped Melinda's sense of reality and contributed to her obsessive and violent behavior. They claimed that Melinda's jealousy toward Shanda was not just typical teenage angst, that it was the result of deep psychological scars that had never been addressed. In short, Melinda was not an evil mastermind here. She was a damaged, troubled girl who acted out of emotional instability rather than malice. And then Lori's defense followed, and they followed a similar line, saying, like Melinda, that she came from this abusive household and her fascination with violence and the occult, those were coping mechanisms for all the trauma she had endured. The defense portrayed Lori as a girl who had been desensitized to violence from a young age, and while she certainly played a role in the murder, they argued that her actions were driven by a need for control and power in a world where she had very little of it. And this also can be true. I guess a question in the back of our minds here could be, even if we know the reason why she did it, if it was because of trauma, doesn't that still make her dangerous? Or if she gets help, she's not dangerous anymore? Can we just get rid of all that trauma? Does that happen? These are questions that are going through people's minds, and these are questions that need to be asked. And so it went. I mean, the defense trying to paint a picture of 4 girls who were undeniably guilty, but they were also victims. Prosecution saying, hey, too bad about their backgrounds, but they all made this choice to participate in this murder. So the case becomes truly complex as they dive into this. Is the jury going to hold these girls fully accountable for their actions, given their troubled backgrounds and the power influence of peer dynamics? Or does their past trauma provide some level of explanation, maybe even mitigation for what they did? These questions haunted the courtroom, and they divided the public. And they're still divided today, by the way, because these things don't have a comfortable, finite answer. At the heart of this controversy is the main question: influence versus responsibility, right? How much blame can be placed on Melinda? She was a ringleader, but how about the other girls, like Hope and Tony, who were more reluctant to participate? The legal system ultimately found all 4 girls guilty of varying degrees of murder, but the public's opinion, it's been far more divided. One of the main points of contention is whether Hope and Tony should have received lighter sentences. Others believed that Hope and Tony, though they were less active, they were still crucial. Then you have the psychological dynamics that's also causing controversy here. Many experts have pointed out that this case is an extreme example of what can happen when young minds are influenced by the wrong people. Melinda, with her deep-rooted anger and jealousy, wielded considerable power over the group. Lori was rebellious, but it heightened this sense of danger and violence. But can we blame pure influence for murder? Then we talked about the groupthink, where individuals in the context of a group, they lose their ability to make rational individual decisions, and instead they feed off the collective energy of the group. We see this in a lot of different situations: ordering food, ordering drinks, what to do that day, elections, you know it. How much of these girls' actions were driven by fear of standing out, and how much by a shared sense of evil? Is it possible that all of the girls had a capacity for this violence within them already, and they just needed some help activating it? In the years since this trial, the case has been the subject of countless discussions, documentaries, and psychological studies, each trying to untangle the web of influence, responsibility, and violence that led to Shanda Sharer's death. And while the girls who committed the crime have served or are serving their sentences, the debate about what truly happened that night and why continues to rage on. As we reach the end here of this tragic and disturbing story, I want to leave you with the most pressing question. How do you decide who's truly responsible for this murder, the murder of Shanda? Was Melinda the sole mastermind, driven by jealousy and rage? Or did the influence of the group dynamic make all four girls equally responsible? Can groupthink be an excuse? Can it feed on itself where everyone's doing something they would never do because of the group energy? It's easy to see Melinda as the leader and assume that the others were merely following, but that doesn't change the fact that all four girls had the opportunity to stop or leave or seek help, and that none of them did. These are the questions for the jury. And the court decided. So now it's a question for us. What about the backgrounds? What about having a ringleader? What about peer pressure? And what about justice? When you think about this case, remember, these are adolescents. I mean, in a world where teenagers are constantly influenced by their peers, and a lot of times these peers are strangers online, right? How do we draw the line between following a crowd and committing an unforgivable act? Can this happen again? Sure. In today's age of social media and hyper-connected lives. I mean, have we learned anything from the murder of Shanda Sharer? Or are we still just as vulnerable? In the end, you, the listener, are left to decide. The facts of this case are undeniable. A 12-year-old girl was brutally murdered by a group of teenage girls. But the interpretation of those facts and the conclusions we draw from them are far more complex. And that, my friends, is something for you to think about. As always, thank you for joining me on another chaotic ride. I hope this episode has left you with more questions than answers, because that's the nature of cases like this. There's rarely a single satisfying explanation. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay out of trouble. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.